This is a true crime podcast. It contains adult themes and content and may not be suitable for all listeners. Listener discretion is advised.
You lost all constitutional rights the moment you walked through that door. When the judge sat down there, I sentenced you to 10 years at the Idaho State Penitentiary. You walked in that door, you was a number. And the inmates understood that.
If you're out there, there were passengers to be in here, just lay down and do it.
Those inmates that were here in the institution during an execution, it had an impression on them that maybe was still with them to some extent. Maybe they don't think about it anymore, but it had an impression on them, I'm sure.
They wouldn't let me out until I get back to stuff. 7 months later, I give it back to them.
That was one of the problems we ran into. Is you had 5 or 6 guys that were sitting in a place, smoking and joking and drinking coffee. Pretty quick, they'd hatched a plan in there to get under your skin some way or try to figure a way out.
Welcome, folks, to another episode of the Behind Gray Walls podcast about the old Idaho State Penitentiary and the men and women who lived and worked here. My name's Anthony. I'm joined in the studio here with Skye.
It's me. I'm here.
Whoa,
Yay.
and Sam.
I'm always here.
Yay!
We're in the trenches.
Hooray!
And yes. Oh my gosh, it feels so good to be in the flesh together and tell some stories here.
I know.
Kicking off a new season.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I'm so excited. I missed you guys.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
I miss doing this.
I know.
This is so fun.
I know. Super great.
Yeah.
So, yes, I'm so excited to be back.
Is this too much room being down here for you instead of your closet?
I know. I'm still in my closet. I have
is-
to look at people now. I don't know.
Yeah, sincerely weird to be able to make eye contact with both of you.
It's too much.
So strange. I love it. Wow. Like old times.
Like old times. I know. Can you believe we're coming up on or actually, I guess by the time this comes out, we will be past 5 years. Is that the craziest thing? We started in 2019 because that was when I left for school.
That's insane. I feel like 20 years older, though. That's a weird thing.
Tell me about it. I found a gray hair.
Oh, geez.
I'm 30.
You can see it. They're all over me.
No,
so-
whatever. You have nice, full, luscious blonde hair.
Oh, those are grays that you're seeing.
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
No, seriously. I have so many grays now. It's crazy.
This old penitentiary. It just ages you, whether you work here or lived here, I guess.
It does.
Sam, any gray hair for you? Yours is looking pretty dark.
For real?
And your beard?
Ever since I was about 22, I've been getting a lot of just silver sparks. I bet I'm going to be completely silver by the time I'm 40.
Wow.
I'd rather be silver and still have a head of hair.
Yeah,
though.
so true.
You know what I mean?
Silver fox.
On wood.
Yeah.
That's all I'm hoping. Is just to
Seriously.
have hair in the next 5 years.
So anyway, after all this hair talk, is this why we don't do it in person? Because we just get so distracted.
Actually, I am talking about a barber today. So
Okay,
this is
well,
perfect.
this is
a good
excellent.
transition.
Let's segue into it. See what you got.
All right. So I am covering William Edward Wilde, number 2368. My sources are, of course, William's prison file located at the Idaho State Archives, digitized Idaho Daily Statesman through Newsbank, hosted by the Boise, Maine Library. Thank you, Library. Library of Congress, Chronicling America, digitized newspapers, newspapers.com, and Warden's Biennial Reports, as well as the book Behind Gray Walls by Patrick Charles Murphy. I'll read a little passage from
Hey,
it.
that sounds familiar.
Right, yeah. So this season, I'm going to try my best to incorporate more of Patrick's book into some of my episodes. So, William Edward Wilde, coolest name
Yeah,
ever.
wild is sweet.
He was born November 25th, 1874, according to his World War I registration card and the 1900 census. Born in Missouri to S.J. or J.H., depending on the document, and Elora or Flora Wilde. His father was from Missouri, and his mother was from Kentucky. The family moved west from Missouri to Whitman, Washington, where they appeared on the county census record taken on April 4th, 1887, when William was 12 years old. Whitman is on the Idaho-Washington border near Moscow, Idaho, and his father listed his occupation as farmer, which is where William likely found his affinity and future listed job of horsebreaker. For non-equestrians, these are the folks that familiarize horses to being saddled, wearing bridles, and having riders on their back. So dangerous, but probably like the most rewarding and exciting job. I imagine like skydiving. Being a skydiving instructor would have a similar danger level and excitement.
A lot of skill, a lot of patience.
Yeah. Handling snakes maybe for Sam here at the site sometimes. Throughout most of his teenage and adult life, William lived in the Northwest between Washington and Oregon. He left home at the age of 19, around 1893, and while in his mid-20s, William fell in line with Billy and George Gibbons, nicknamed the Crab Creek Boys, in Washington state. The brothers had rap sheets and served terms for cattle rustling in the 1890s. It was suspected that Billy Gibbons had secret staging stations about every 100 miles in northern Washington along the Canadian border, where he would travel by night with stolen horses and hide out during the day. In February 1895, Billy was actually arrested for stealing grain, and while in jail in Sprague, Washington, he and a partner broke out and stole some horses to escape. Both men were recaptured a little over a week later. Billy Gibbons was charged with horse stealing and entered the Washington State Penitentiary on March 29, 1895. He served 3 years and a month. According to a newspaper account, he proclaimed to a friend after his stint that he would never go back to the penitentiary. This wasn't a change in his outlaw ways, but a threat to anyone who would attempt to arrest him in the future. William and Billy were later involved in one of the most sensational Wild West gunfights in Washington history. You guys probably don't want to hear about it, do you?
Sam hates Wild West gun shooting. Hates
gun
it.
fights.
I have never heard him talk less about a subject.
That was so 1890s.
So, William, back to him. He appears in the 1900 census living in Republic, Washington. And Republic is in the northeast corner of Washington near the Idaho-Canada border. And around 1900, it was a mining town in decline. Gold discoveries in the mid-1890s led to the quick development of ore mills, but the lower quality of the ore, along with the development of rail lines that made shipping ore to surrounding mills, meant work was drying up in the area. William, who listed his occupation as a miner, may have found himself out of work with the closure of these mills and mines. In late April 1902, William Wilde and Billy Gibbons, who was just 4 years out of the Washington State Penitentiary, rounded up a band of horses in Okanogan County, Washington. This county is on the Washington-Canada border in northern Washington, the largest county in the state. And it's kind of like Idaho's Owyhee County. It's this massive area with a small population, mostly agriculture, undeveloped land. Billy Gibbons and William Wilde trekked southeast through Washington on their way to Wyoming to sell the stolen horses. Deputy Nichol, such a strange
with an N? Like
N.
Mitchell, but with an N?
Exactly.
Oh.
I know, it was such a strange one. Nichol of Okanogan County tracked and followed the two men for 2 weeks. The trail led to Elmira, Washington, 90 miles south and about 70 miles west of Spokane. On May 4th, 1902, one of the, quote, most desperate battles ever fought in the Northwest between officers of the law and desperados, end quote, occurred. William, unaware that he was being tracked, was caught by surprise while tending to the horses in a stable. When the deputy and town constable entered the stable, William attempted to pull his gun, but the deputy already had the drop on him. William didn't put up a fight and was handcuffed and taken to a local hotel where he was held in the office. About 20 men stationed in the office were told to keep an eye on William while the lawmen tracked down his partner, Billy Gibbons. Billy, he was seen entering a saloon in town, so the deputy and constable followed his tracks. Billy was in a side room in the saloon with a few men. When Deputy Nichol entered the room, gun drawn, he caught Billy by surprise. He commanded Billy to surrender. Thinking quickly, Billy jumped behind a bystander and shoved the man towards the deputy. He drew his Colt revolver with his left hand and at the same time ran towards the side door. He raised the revolver and aimed at the deputy, but Nichol was too quick. The deputy fired. The bullet entered Billy's torso under the armpit of his upraised left arm. Billy pulled the trigger, but his bullet missed its mark. He He continued through a side door out the saloon and ran towards his saddle horse about 2 blocks away, turning and firing back at Deputy Mitchell as he ran. While he mounted his horse, he was struck again in the hip and another time in the arm. His horse was shot in the hips but continued to run a quarter of a mile. Billy jumped off the dying horse and mounted another. Unscathed, Deputy Mitchell mounted his own horse and pursued the fleeing, bullet-riddled desperado out of town. The two fired back and forth for miles and miles. Billy, who had a belt full of ammunition when he entered town, finally relented after losing blood during the 11-mile attempt at escape. He had 2 shells left. Newspapers noted that about 30 rounds were fired during this pursuit. Billy threw down his gun, raised his hands in surrender, blood pouring from the wounds throughout his body. Oof. Deputy Mitchell brought him back to Elmira, where he succumbed to the wounds. According to the Elmore Bulletin newspaper, Billy, quote, died at midnight in the presence of his father and mother, end quote. Meanwhile, William Wilde, who was handcuffed and guarded by 20 men in the hotel office, waited. He would have heard the gun battle going on outside and likely thought his partner would survive and rescue him. The men watching him were likely frightened that they were guarding a man who rolled with a heavily armed posse willing to die rather than be taken by authorities. Late that night, after Billy's death, as the town was settling down after one of the most desperate gun battles in Washington's history, quote, a face appeared on the outside of the window, and Wilde smiled and dashed through the door.
Shut up. 20 people.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
So despite still being handcuffed, he runs out of this hotel and down the block. He mounts a horse and flees the
with
town.
His hands behind him?
Hands behind his back.
Imagine getting on a horse with your hands.
Honestly, like... This is I'm just because I'm in the job searching phase right now, it's like but like he just had all these skills that he could be like, yeah, I broke horses as a living. Now I can be your getaway guy and I can get away. And I am real Houdini in this instance. Yeah. That's amazing.
Yeah. They never find out who that man was who popped his head in the window, but maybe it was Billy's brother coming into town to rescue them or something. Yeah.
Interesting.
Somebody from this gang. Yeah.
Or what if it wasn't a person from the gang? And William was just trying to use that as like a decoy.
Totally.
Or
like
someone just
bluffing.
walked by and he was like, hey, like, will you help me kind of thing? Yeah.
Oh, man. When you look at his mugshot, check out our Facebook page. Look at his mugshot. You can see him grinning.
Sure.
I think that was a big part of his allure.
I won't lie. Like if I had escaped from 20 different men with handcuffs behind my back, I probably would also be smiling in my mugshot because that's insane. Like, you feel like I got away with something.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
This is such a Wild West movie sort of thing that I was like, oh my gosh, we have to have one of our 13 Stories filmmakers recreate this.
Yeah, I could totally see that in a movie of him just like hopping up on a bench or something and then just like without his hands just like straight hopping. Like it's very cinematic. It's so very cool. Cinematic.
20 members of a posse. Yeah. That's so many people to run away from. And like with no fear you're going to be shot while you're fleeing.
Right.
Well, and that or he just doesn't have anything to lose, right? Where it's just like I end up in jail or I get away or dead and
and the journalists actually speculated. They're like, he was being guarded by 20 men. Mm-hmm. They heard this gunfight go on outside. They're not going to risk their neck chasing after this escapee. That partner likely has the gun aimed at the door ready for the first man who walks out after William. So that's why they were just like, I'm not a deputized. I'm not an lawman. It's not my job. He escaped too bad.
Not my circus, not my monkeys. Bye, buddy.
Exactly, yeah.
Totally.
So just like, oh my gosh. So William is free, unscathed. He escapes a certain sentence in prison in Washington and a death sentence if he had pulled his gun in that stable. He was a bona fide outlaw.
Mama says you ain't bona fide.
Bona fide. A May 3rd, 1902 article in the Rathdrum Silver Blade exclaimed, quote, the day of the stage robber, stock thief, and train robber is fast drawing to a close. Where once they flourished on the scattered herds of the pioneers, they now have a thickly settled community to deal with, and it is no easy matter to get away with stock without being detected, end quote. As the West settled and communities grew, the romanticized Wild West was ending. One name that kept popping up during my research was Buffalo Bill, who hosted a traveling Wild West show throughout the country. So William Wilde, Bill Wilde kept popping up Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. And I was just like, no, that's not what I'm looking for. Thousands.
Yeah.
And they were going on in Washington at the time that this is happening, which is just so funny. That the Wild West was just a few miles away.
Yeah, right.
happening. The time of pioneer wagon trains being ambushed and ransacked was a source of the new generation's family entertainment. William Wilde, however, was living the desperado life and hid with his band of outlaws in eastern Oregon, one of the few remaining frontiers. The next account of him appeared the following year in Eagle Valley, Oregon, on the Oregon-Idaho border east of Baker City and north of Weiser, Idaho. During the summer of 1903, William stole 6 horses and a saddle from an Eagle Valley rancher named Frank Jasper, and 2 more horses from one of Frank's unnamed neighbors. Baker City authorities were on the case. They presented a reward of $250 for William's arrest. Time for our favorite game.
I do love this game.
1903. How much do you think that would be in 2024's currency?
Oh, I'm going to say $750.
750?
Am I going to be so off?
I'm going to guess 1,500.
1,500. Wow. It was about 9,000.
Oh,
$8,907.16.
Okay, well, I was way off.
Yeah.
It's because those inflation calculators don't start, so
It's
I don't
probably
have
not
those
accurate.
numbers memorized.
I know,
That's what it is.
Yeah, only from 1913
Of course.
onward. Yeah.
Everything else I know by heart,
Yeah, so,
obviously.
like close to $9,000 though, for his recapture, which is pretty cool. William crossed the border into Idaho, and Latah County Sheriff James Keene received a telegram noting that William was seen in Genesee, Idaho, between Moscow and Lewiston, with the 8 stolen horses. They listed his name as William Carver and described him as, quote, 30, 5 feet 7.5 inches tall, dark complexion, looking like a Spaniard, with black hair, eyes, and mustache. He weighs about 175 pounds, is badly pockmarked, and has a scar on one cheek. Carver is said to be a fluent talker, end quote. So I think he was kind of a silver tongue, he could just say anything, and just there's something really likable about him. And if you look at his mugshots, he seems charming. Yeah, he
has a very friendly face.
He does.
Yeah.
Totally. Man. So let's get to some vigilante committees. Yes. So have you heard of the Anti-Horse Thief Association? Yeah.
I have not.
So they were a committee who developed actually during the Civil War along the border states between the Union and Confederacy that focused on defending and returning stolen horses. U.S. Marshals, local police, they weren't enough to maintain order, so citizens just put it upon themselves to take the law into their own hands. In 1901, so about 40 years after all of this started, the Daily River Press from Fort Benton, Montana, printed that the association claimed membership up to about 10,000 people across the United States. Wow. Quote, it was originally started to put a stop to horse stealing, but has spread out until it is now striving to stop the commission of nearly all classes of crime, end quote. So John Waters, he is a Rathdrum, Idaho native, was a member of this association and likely saw the articles looking for William and the $250 reward. So John took up the cause, and he joined a posse with Rathdrum Sheriff Whitney and his deputy Edwin Doust. William made it through Latah County. I couldn't find any details, but one newspaper account did allude to a story that he was nearly arrested while crossing through Latah County, but slyly escaped his captors and continued his journey. He arrived at around 150 miles north in Sandpoint, Idaho. He checked into a room under the name H.W. Walker. John Waters, along with Sheriff Whitney and a marshal named Sawyer, strolled into Sandpoint and began their investigation. On October 21st, 1903, the trio spotted William Wilde near Fritz and Ringel's saloon on the corner of First Avenue and Bridge Street in Sandpoint. He was in the act of hitching up the stolen horses to a post when the 3 men pulled their revolvers and ordered William to raise his hands. He made a move towards his holster and was slow to finally obey the commands of the officers. Quote, they were not over 10 feet from him, but had it been double that distance, Sheriff Whitney believes that Wildes would have put up a fight, end quote. William surrendered. The officers discovered 2 loaded revolvers concealed on his body. He was arrested and charged with carrying concealed weapons and lodged in the city jail. According to one account, quote, Wild is one of the most celebrated outlaws of the West. Carver, while in Baker County, was a member and leader of one of the worst gangs of thieves that ever infested eastern Oregon. Included in this gang were young men belonging to some of the best pioneer families in the county. End quote. The newspaper even alluded to the gang murdering a stockman named John Lawrence during the summer of 1896, and I actually looked up the death and found it, and they thought it was a suicide. They found him dead with a revolver on the ground. Unfortunately, there's no way of knowing where the authorities got this information unless one of the members of the gang confessed or it was just a hunch from these lawmen. Authorities used the concealed weapons charge to hold William until the sheriff of Baker City, Oregon could arrive with extradition papers. Frank Jasper, who William stole the horses from, accompanied Sheriff H.K. Brown from Baker City to Sandpoint and recovered 2 of his 6 stolen horses and the saddle. He sold the 2 remaining horses in Sandpoint and returned home with his saddle. The sheriff returned with William. He was charged with larceny and sentenced to the Oregon State Penitentiary. He was received on November 29th, 1903, a little over a month after his capture in Sandpoint. So I have his intake information and his mugshot from the Oregon State Penitentiary. You can see he's got a bit of a grin on his face.
He sure
here.
Does. He's just so happy. He's
Totally.
just doing what he loves.
Definitely check out our Facebook page, and I will post that in the comments. So William Wild, number 4797, alias William Carver, from Baker County, where he was received from. He's 29 years old, 5 feet 6 3/4 inches tall, 157 pounds. He had black hair, brown eyes, a scar on the center of his forehead, 4 scars on the top of his head, a blue scar at the edge of his nose, a cut scar above his right elbow, and 5 scars on his left calf. His occupation was horsebreaker, and his sentence was 8 years. Looking at his mugshot, I mean, it was one of the first things that drew me to learning his story. It is in his old Idaho Penitentiary prison file as well. He's just got this closed mouth smile, this
grin,
look of joy across his face, and just based on the clout that he had received as this, famous desperado outlaw, he probably felt pretty lucky to be alive, and he was probably in pretty good standing when he arrived at the Oregon State Penitentiary. So the Oregon State Penitentiary, which was located in Salem, Oregon, opened in 1871, a year before the old Idaho State Penitentiary. And I found a September 1904 punishment that was used on prisoners at that institution just about a year after he arrives, that some, like myself today, might find delightful, actually. They turned from flogging, using a cat and nine tails to beat prisoners, to the cold water cure.
You would like that.
I love it, yeah. You want to hear about it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Definitely.
Quote, the cold water remedy consists of stripping the prisoners to the skin and turning upon him a stream of cold water from the ordinary garden hose. The infliction of the punishment is not as brutal as flogging. It leaves no scars nor permanent injuries, and the punishment ends the moment the water is turned off. A prisoner who has been subjected to the punishment once wants no more of it, though he may be smiling within a few moments after the ordeal is over. Governor Chamberlain and the prison authorities are highly pleased over the result of the experiments, for they have been desirous of abolishing the whip. The cold water cure leaves the offending prisoner with a cleaner body and apparently a more peaceful mind, end quote.
I could see that, it would be kind of like getting out of I guess on a hot summer day it would be nice, but I feel like in the winter, if you did that, that might be a little more jarring.
But if the alternative is a beating,
yeah,
you
fair
know
enough.
what I mean? I'd take the water over.
I was half expecting it to be like waterboarding or something crazy.
I know, me too. When I saw this, I was like, oh no, oh gee, they're just literally probably in front of everybody,
right?
Spraying you, hosing you down.
It's like
probably high pressure too.
Yeah, high pressure. Your manhood is probably affected by this cold water in front of everybody. Sure. That's likely a part of the infliction.
kind of degrading,
humiliating.
But it's also just like a super advanced form of like when a cat does something bad and you just have to spray them with a water bottle until they stop.
Dog,
yeah,
literally
exactly.
chased her down last night with a squirt bottle. And, my lord,
that's very funny.
I give myself a cold water cure every morning because I love cold showers. But so according to his Oregon Penitentiary convict record, William was awarded 160 days for extra work, which allowed him to be released early from the prison. Any guesses on what job he may have had in prison?
I'm guessing a barber.
A barber.
Hey.
You got it. Yes.
I was going to say something with horses.
I
forgot that you had
Would
mentioned at the beginning.
Would you trust this man with horses in prison?
Fair enough.
So, no. Yeah. So he was the prison barber. During his time there, actually in 1905, according to his old pen record, his dad actually passed away August 6, 1905. So while he's incarcerated, his dad passes away, leaving his mother widowed. I did find a J.H. Wild being buried in a Loomis, Washington cemetery, in the Mountain View Cemetery there. And on his findagrave.com memorial, it did note that he was a Civil War veteran. So, again, with any inclination of what his father's real first name actually was, there were so many J.H. Wilds that served in the Civil War from Missouri too, that I was
interesting.
I have no idea. So unfortunately I couldn't find any more details about him. But on March 29th, 1909, after serving 5 years and 4 months, William was released from the Oregon State Penitentiary. And he appeared to stay out of trouble for a couple of years. This changed when he stole a horse from a man named Mount Moore in Durkee, Oregon. Mount later testified that he raised the gray mare from colthood and had a large letter Z branded on the left stifle. William headed east and entered Idaho with the stolen horse. In Caldwell, a gentleman named E.P. Engel continued to dominate the local business. The Caldwell Tribune on April 30th, 1915 noted, quote, Mr. Engel now has almost a monopoly on the livery business in this city and is making preparations to take care of the trade, end quote. With such a large business, it was easy for William to target him. William came into town and left the horses at Engel's livery stable on September 3rd. The horses were left overnight, and the next day, William, under the alias John S. Norris, or J.S. Norris, sold the horses for $125 each to a horse buyer named Sam Parker. The employee who purchased the horse on Parker's behalf, his name was Will Mucker, worked at the Engel barn, and after accepting the offer and taking the $250, William left the stable. Will Mucker, who sold the horses, was walking down the street with J.W. Smead, father of Ralph Smead, for anyone who remembers the reader board on 21st Avenue, the old Smead board, if you've ever been to Caldwell and seen that. Very conservative messaging on there. Was walking with Will Mucker, and Will told Mr. Smead, quote, there's the man I bought the horses off, end quote. So Smead actually served as a witness at the bank for William to cash the check before he left town. Later that evening, after William cashed the $250 check, he returned to the livery stable. He unhitched the 2 horses he sold, along with one of Engel's horses, and skipped town. So he's 1 horse plus $250 richer as he leaves town. On September 24th, 1915, Engel posted a $30 reward, or $10 each, for the return of, quote, 1 sorrel gelding, roached mane, weighed about 1,300 pounds, 5 years old, don't remember the brand. 1 gray mare, weighed 1,300 pounds, 4 years old, don't know the brand. And 1 black mare, 12 years old, weighed about 1,000 pounds, branded on left shoulder, end quote. And a few days later, he posted the reward in the Idaho Statesman again, this time describing the brand on the black mare as an S over a lazy S, which would be an S over a sideways S in horse branding. Such a fascinating art.
Yeah, horse branding is interesting.
William traveled with 3 horses through eastern Oregon. He crossed paths with a man from Ontario named Frank Spencer, and the 2 men decided to trade saddles. So this was an early step for William to disguise and protect himself. Caldwell Sheriff Froman was not going to let William go. He, along with Oregon officers, tracked William to Riverside and to Steens Mountain. He was finally apprehended with the 3 horses and saddle near Prineville, Oregon. After making the arrest, Sheriff Froman cuffed and chained William to prevent any chance of escape. Froman escorted William as far as Vail, Oregon, where he was lodged in jail. William refused to go willingly back into Idaho, so extradition papers had to be signed between Idaho's Governor Moses Alexander and Oregon's Governor Whitcomb so he could return to Caldwell for trial. This meant that the sheriff had to travel to the capital in Boise and then to the capital in Salem before he could return to Vail to bring William back to Caldwell for trial. Oof. Oh, such a pain. And while in jail in Vail, William went to work to keep himself out of prison. First, he traded clothes with another prisoner. Next, a knife was left accidentally in his cell, and he quickly shaved his beard and his mustache and his head to hide his identity. He remained silent and refused to speak to anybody. Finally, Sheriff Froman returned from Salem with the signed extradition papers and brought William to the jail in Caldwell on October 11, 1915. Before he left, he demanded the prisoner wearing William's clothes turn them over to him. So they did not have time for William to change his clothes. When he arrived back in Idaho, quote, the prisoner had been lodged in jail here for a few hours when he succeeded in burning a pair of overalls and a hat, which he had worn at the time he sold the steeds here, end quote. Within the first 18 hours, he had successfully burned his clothing, shaved his head and mustache, and fashioned a saw with a table knife that was left over at breakfast that he was attempting to saw through his cell in the Canyon County Jail. To prevent William from getting far if he escaped, he was fashioned with a, quote, regulation steel prison boot, end quote. On October 15th, the 3 horses were returned to the Engle Livery. A $5,000 bond was put on William. His trial was set for November 29th, 1915. At his arraignment, William assured the judge that his true name was William Wild. While I was researching this, he was listed as John S. Norris, his alias. Frank Spencer, the man who he traded the saddles with, was also arrested and brought in and held to explain why he had Engle's saddle. He explained to the judge that William traded saddles with him. The trial began at 9:30 a.m. on Monday, November 29th, 1915. The state called 11 witnesses. William's defense called none. The trial started with E.P. Engle, who owned the livery, followed by Will Mucker, who purchased the horses, then J.W. Smead. Smead confirmed to the bank teller that the check made out to William was real and should be cashed. Mount Moore, the man whose gray mare was originally stolen, took the stand and told his history with the horse, and that William had stopped at his ranch around the middle of August that year, prior to the theft. A farmer living near Vail said he met William on September 6 near town and noted the brands on the 3 horses he traveled with. A 15-year-old boy named Henry Slayton was brought to the stand. He was from Skull Springs, Oregon, and he noted that he saw the horses and thought they were his neighbors. So he checked them out carefully and noted that William was at the home of Frank Spencer. Frank Spencer and his brother Clark were brought to the stand and testified that William stopped at their ranch and described the brands on the 3 horses. Quote, he drew a diagram on the courtroom blackboard to show how the brand on the sorrel horse had been changed from a 46 to AHB, end quote. So,
I mean, I guess this is kind of his thing, right? Is that he is so brazen with his actions. Like, he's always talking to people. He's, like, always being seen by other people. Like, he seems to think, and thus far has been proven right, that, like, even if he gets caught, he can escape. Right. Like, he's so confident in himself.
100%.
He's a man with a plan.
Yeah. So that's why, they have to have 11 people who are like, yep, that's the guy. Yeah, that's the guy. Yes, this is the guy, It's just so funny, the courtroom, and then the defense. Oh, we'll get to that in a second. So he described trading saddles with William. Then this guy named J.W. Farmer took the stand next, and he described being deputized by Sheriff Froman to help find William. He said he found the horses on a pasture in Prineville, Oregon, and he had a long history with William, even shoeing one of William's horses in the past. Sheriff Froman was the final witness, and he talked about William's attempts to hide his identity, which served to create more suspicion to his case. The defense attempted to say that there was a lack of evidence. That was the defense. It was like, and then the defense you know, I don't think there's enough to really pin him down, really, you know. There's
they would. Do you think it just would have been better if they walked up and just said, like, Your Honor, we have no defense? Because that's crazy.
Kind of that was it, you know. They just didn't really have anything. and he likely wasn't speaking to many people. He was trying to keep his mouth shut and like, you know, if I don't say anything, I could probably get off of this. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. William was found guilty of grand larceny. That same day, the judge sentenced him to 5 to 14 years in the Idaho State Penitentiary instead of the typical 1 to 14. And I found an interesting article in the Caldwell Tribune titled 20 Days in the Oregon Boot. And it said that William received justice and was paying the penalty for his crime, but the difference was the way that Sheriff Froman contained him with the Oregon boot, the heavy iron on his ankle for 20 straight days. Quote, "This is a form of refined cruelty that does great credit to Mr. Froman's courage and kind-heartedness." That does great credit. I love that. The Oregon boot is an instrument invented for the purpose of preventing desperate men from escaping from custody. It is usually used while traveling when the opportunities for escape are unusually good. It is never used while the prisoner is confined in his cell or under the direct attention of the custodian. Most sheriffs would be ashamed to use the Oregon boot as Mr. Froman used it because it is at once a torture to the prisoner and an announcement to the world that the custodian is afraid of his prisoner. In this particular case, the sheriff was undoubtedly afraid of Norris, who, also wild, who, when he is fat, weighs about 125 pounds.
That's when he's fat?
Yeah. Common humanity demands that these men, many of whom are innocent of crime, should be provided with a safe place of custody without resort to the Oregon boot. Civilization demands that men be not cruelly treated, end quote. And just to like add on to this, this other article made fun of the sheriff further by saying that the single traveling guard who brought William to the prison the next day was foolhardy for not having an entire squad of deputies to escort this one person.
But it clearly doesn't matter, like 1 or 20. It doesn't matter. I
know, yeah. And that's what Sheriff Froman was like, no, this guy's slippery.
Yeah.
There's no chance he's leaving my grasp. But, everybody in Caldwell is like, You're overreacting. This is horrible. And for him to be wearing an Oregon boot, and they were saying that even when he was going to the courtroom to be wearing an Oregon boot, that added to the chance of him being convicted as well. That he is so dangerous that we can't even trust him here. Which I think Sheriff Froman, there's a little bit there that like it was probably a good thing because I think William would have tried to run.
Yes.
Try to get on a horse with an Oregon boot.
Ooh.
No.
Do we still have that Oregon boot in the case in the gift shop now?
We don't have it in the case. We do have it in our collection still, but it's not on display. But in the future, come back maybe this time next year after. Yeah. So, William Wild, number 2368, alias J.S. Norris, received November 30th, 1915 from Canyon County. Crime, grand larceny. Pled not guilty. Sentenced 5 to 14 years. Age 41. Born in Missouri. Occupation, common laborer this time. He is 5'6" and 7/8 inches tall. Dark complexion with black hair streaked with gray, hazel eyes, and weighing 151 pounds. He was single.
So he is fat, to be clear.
Right. 150 pounds, yeah. Such a weird thing to think.
Very weird, yeah.
His father died 9 years earlier when he was 32 years old. His mother was still living. He left home at the age of 19. He had no religious instruction and never attended Sunday school. He could read and write and had attended school until he turned 14. He was a moderate drinker. His former imprisonment including serving in Salem, Oregon as number 4794 on an 8-year sentence for horse stealing. He served 5 years, 4 months and was released March 29th, 1909. His peculiarity in build and features were described as regular. His teeth were fair. He had a full beard, wore 6.5-inch size boot and a 7.25-inch size hat. He came in only with his clothing, which was stored in the commissary. His parents were U.S. citizens, and he spent most of his time in Washington and Oregon. Warden John Snook only noted on William's Bertillon that he completed on December 4th, 1915, that William had a 3-inch scar just above his right knee. Now, William entered the prison shortly after Patrick Charles Murphy, who was number 2338, who wrote the book Behind Gray Walls that this podcast is named after. William was likely held in the territorial prison as a fish at the same time as Patrick Murphy. Warden John Snook was actively attempting to develop some sort of prison industry for the entire prison population to participate in. Between 1915 and 1916, he developed prison farms that could provide work for part of the year for about 40% of the prison population. As I've mentioned regularly, Snook was adamant that prisoners needed something to fulfill their time. Quote, "Regular work is essential to the physical and moral welfare of prisoners. Idleness begets bodily and mental deterioration, develops vice and insanity, and retards whatever improvement a man might otherwise be susceptible of, while all that is good comes from labor. That which is bad is usually the result of idleness." End quote. Besides farming, prisoners were also sent to develop Idaho's roads. During the fall of 1915, men were sent to develop the state highways at Shoshone Falls. The following year, a camp was established near Whitebird, Idaho, where the highway heading north and south was developed. It's north of McCall between Riggins and Grangeville. And the legislator made a $10,000 appropriation for the best road-laying equipment for the prison camps, but Governor Moses Alexander vetoed this money. So the prisoners were equipped with picks and shovels to create roads for Idaho drivers. In 1917, Warden Frank DeKay expanded on Warden Snook's improvements with the development of Mosley Ranch, which today is the grounds of Warm Springs Golf Course. Only about 20 acres were being used at that time, while the rest was dilapidated and not being cultivated. Warden DeKay had prisoners clear and develop over 60 acres between 1917 and 1918 to allow for more farming and prison labor. With World War I raging, as well as the deadly influenza pandemic, many jobs had to shut down temporarily between 1918 and 1920. Farming continued, as well as the development of a profitable industry raising turkeys. Warden Cuddy wrote in the 1919-1920 Warden's Biennial Report, quote, "The poultry has met the demands of the institution, and we now have a herd of approximately 1,400 turkeys, most of which will be sold by January 1st, 1921. The turkey herd has been a source of considerable earning to the institution," end quote. So this is an important feature of what happens next during William's time in prison. William filled out the Selective Service draft registration card with Warden Frank DeKay in 1918 at the age of 43. He listed S.J. Wild, his widowed mother, living in Gem, Idaho, as his nearest relative. And he's described as medium height and build with gray-colored eyes and nearly gray hair. So he's in his late 40s at this time. William survived the influenza as it ripped through the prison and infected the majority of the population here, as 6 men died from it. He requested to go before the July 1919 Board of Pardons. He wrote a letter to the board which starts out recounting his crime and conviction and then notes that the horses and saddle were returned to their rightful owner, but his sentence was excessive and, quote, "the result of false statements circulated during his trial," end quote. He continued stating that he was, quote, "sole support for his mother, who is 72 years old and who has been a respected citizen of Shoshone County, Idaho for over 20 years," end quote. He ended his request to the board saying that he, quote, "honorably pledges his word to live a law-abiding life in the future and become a respected member of the community in which he resides and to be a support and comfort to his aged mother in her declining years," end quote. Soon after this letter arrived to the pardon board, another by attorney H.A. Griffiths arrived in William's support. He noted that William had served 3.5 years for horse stealing and, quote, "from my conversations with Mr. Wild and from my observations of his appearance and actions, I am convinced that if he is given the opportunity, he intends to become a good citizen and that he is thoroughly convinced that there is nothing to be gained for him by violating the law. I also believe that he has firmness and a tact sufficient to carry him through in his good intentions. I can see no good purpose to be served in restricting him of his liberty further, and I think the punishment is already more than sufficient expiation of his offense," end quote. Several more letters arrived with the opposite tone, calling for William's continued incarceration. I'm not at liberty to share these letters, but I can say that they painted William as a hardened desperado and criminal who was likely to return to his life of crime and even go after the men who landed him in the prison. On July 19th, 1919, his application was denied. In December 1919, his mother was living in the Olympia Hotel and posted ads in the newspaper looking for jobs. Quote, elderly lady wants housekeeping position, country preferred, end quote.
It's so sad.
While most of the labor in the prison occurred outside the walls and farms during William's incarceration, he had the fortune of having a work history as a prison barber. He worked as the head of the prison barber shop with a forger named George Dutch Stevenson, number 2689. Patrick Murphy paints a great picture of what the prison barber shop was like behind gray walls. He writes, quote, from the tailor's shop, they took me to the barber shop to be shaved, and it was there that I saw the face, for the first time, of my early morning neighbor. He was talking in a loud, boisterous way as we entered. When he saw me, he stopped as though to get his breath, and then shouted, hello, Murphy! And he shoved a large freckled hand at me as though I was a long-lost brother. But I did not look up or speak, and stepped into an empty barber chair as I had been beckoned to do by my barber. The party who wished to greet me looked silly, grinned, and sat down. You see, this fellow could do a little extra choring, clean spittoons, and occasionally shave a man to get the privilege of lounging in the barber shop and pop off. The barbers are continually bothered with this kind of cattle. I never could learn why all the gossipers in the penitentiary had a craving desire to loaf in the barber shop, nor can I see how the barbers can stand it. For myself, I hate to see shave day come for the few minutes I have to sit in the barber chair and listen to this peculiar class. You see, no shop has a regular guard in it. Each shop has a prisoner acting as head man, and it is almost impossible for one prisoner to keep another prisoner out of the state shop. But the yard guards make frequent trips to the shops during the day. I've seen a bunch of these loafers run out of the barber shop, and as soon as the guard is gone, in 10 minutes they are sneaking back, end quote.
So he is complaining that people are just having a hot gossip sesh in the barber
barbershop,
shop. That's
yeah.
where it's supposed to happen, at the
Patrick Murphy's
salon, and so that's Patrick Murphy saying that, and he's just like, I hate all these gossipers.
Yeah. It's the only time like where we get this idea of like, what was it like in the barber shop?
Yeah. I do always wonder that because we have the barber cell, and so I was always curious, like, how did they get that? The head barber job with the cell, and when before we had the barber cell, what did that shop look like? So that's really interesting.
Well, barber shops and salons are such culture hubs.
Yes.
Like they've always been a place where people go and they talk. And
exactly.
Poor
Gossip.
barbers. Have to act as therapists as well as hair cutters.
Honestly.
And so like in a prison, I'm sure that's only amplified.
Yeah.
Well, and also like I can see how people would use that as like a respite from the hard work they're having to do, right? Is like, totally. I definitely want to sit and just shoot the breeze with whoever's in here. Like,
right.
Yeah, that makes sense. But that's so funny that he didn't like it.
One of my best friends is a barber. Hi, Melissa. She cut my hair this weekend. And part of our...
it looks great, by the way.
Yeah, way to go, Melissa.
Yeah, Melissa.
Yeah. Thanks, Melissa. Part of our session, we talk about our friend group and all the things going on, but mostly I want to hear all the gossip that she hears. Like, what's going on in the shop? Like, what's going on with the other hairdressers?
Oh, my gosh.
It's so fun.
There's a podcast, shout out to another podcast called Normal Gossip, and people will write in gossip and they'll anonymize everything, but it is incredible to just listen to people's gossip and know that you don't have a stake in it. Like that's what I love about it, is you're just like, well, I don't know this person, but I get to like hear about the scandalous things going on in other people's lives. I love a good bit of gossip, but too bad Charles Murphy didn't, because imagine the gossip that's going around in the prison barber shop. It's probably nuts.
And you're hearing about gossip that's going on in the yard, and then there's always gossip amongst the barbers too, like, oh, she's out today for a good reason. I saw her like going out partying, and like I saw her Instagram, and she called in sick. Wink, wink.
Oh man,
so
amazing.
You can imagine just the constant all day long. If you're the barber like William, you're hearing everything, and you're just interacting with everybody all day long. This is part of the reason why they had to close down barbershop proper in the prison
yeah.
yard because it was such a central hub for everybody to go to,
Right.
dealing contraband, drugs and other things.
Do you think, and maybe this will come up, but do you think he would have ever been able to use that gossip as like blackmail?
Oh yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he would have been
He would have known everything.
everybody's friend.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, he knew everybody.
And he's personal. He's a sly talker. He's
Very
friendly.
charming. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, and he's got stories galore about just being Wild West
Remember
Desperado.
one time I escaped 20 people looking after me
Right.
and got on a horse with
How
my
many
hands
people
tied
heard
behind
that
my back.
story?
Seriously.
Yeah.
I mean, he sounds like a great
Yeah,
barber.
he sounds cool.
Honestly.
He sounds cool.
Yeah, and of course, you've got this fellow
Yep.
convict with a razor next to your face.
Yeah.
You're gonna have a great relationship with him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For
You're-
good reason.
Yes, you are not
probably.
going to want to make an enemy out of him for sure.
Yeah. So this is his day to day, and William, according to Idaho Statesman accounts, he's making money. He's taking tips, everything he can. He's making hobby crafts, and he's sending money out to his mom.
Oh, cool.
And he's trying to take care of her and trying to help her maintain life while he's doing his thing here. A man named John McDonald, number 2760, nicknamed Seattle Blackie, was assigned to work under William in the barber shop. And I'll post John's mugshot in the comments of this episode today in our Facebook group. So John enters the penitentiary in July 1919 on a 1 to 14 year sentence after he broke into a drugstore to feed his cocaine habit.
Oh.
Yeah, so I mean, he's dealing with addictions and probably has other things going on. And William and John do not get along. A witness would later say that during one argument between the men, they swore at each other and William even reached for his shears. Fortunately, nothing came of this threat between these two barbers. The yard captain was consulted, and in early May 1920, John McDonald was removed from the barber shop to take another job out in the prison. On Monday, May 3rd, 1920, around noon, John entered the barber shop and sat down in the chair and requested a haircut. There was still bad blood between William and John, and William was like, "No, we're closed at noon. No, I don't have time to cut your hair. Come back later tonight after dinner when we open up the shop again." George Stevenson said that, quote, "wrath-provoking words followed," end quote, and John marched out of the barber shop. He walked to the corner of the prison yard where turkey coops were being constructed by two prisoner carpenters named E.T. Albert and H.M. McDonald. They witnessed John pick up a 2x4 and leave their shop. They shouted for him to put it down, followed him across the prison yard, but it was too late. George Stevenson had his back turned, but, quote, said that although he did not see the blow struck, the thud was plainly heard. Turning around, he saw Wilde lying on the floor, end quote. John McDonald swung and struck William straight across the forehead. George rushed over and helped pick William up. The carpenters arrived at the shop and pulled the plank from John's hand and put a mark on it to distinguish it as the assault weapon. The gravity of the situation seemed to immediately hit John as he helped George carry William's unconscious body to the captain's office. Later, he was taken to St. Luke's Hospital. He never regained consciousness and was pronounced dead the following day.
So John helped. The guy who hit him
Yeah.
was doing it mostly just to sound like wound him.
Yeah.
And then when he realized how hard he hit him, was like, oh no, and like tried to help.
Exactly.
Oh.
So he hits him in the head, and then it's like the gravity of like, oh my God, what did I just do?
Yeah.
It hits him, and then he's like, we gotta save this guy. Takes him to the cabinet shack, and it's too late. He hit him too hard. He fractured his skull with that hit.
A 2x4? Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh.
So John McDonald obviously was immediately thrown into solitary confinement. He was tried and pled guilty to a charge of manslaughter and was handed a second sentence of from 1 to 10 years. He was sent to the insane asylum between 1924 and 1928. So he spent about 4 years at the prison, probably a lot of it in solitary punishment cells. And then he spent another 10 years at the penitentiary after his stint between 24 and 28 at the asylum. William Wilde was, making and selling these hobbycraft items and sending money home to his widowed mother to help pay off her house. Other prisoners actually knew and really liked him. He's the prison barber. Everybody knows this guy. So they actually pitched in and sent a lot of money to his mother. I actually found a bunch of newspaper articles where she was receiving $10 a month just because she was so poor and destitute. And so they helped her pay off the house. And then they actually gathered up money to bury William outside the walls at the Morris Hill prison, at the Morris Hill Cemetery, instead of the prison cemetery. The warden listed a charge in May 1920 to the Summers and Krebs funeral home, a $25 charge for funeral expense. So the warden actually paid for the funeral experience, and he's actually in an unmarked grave at the Morris Hill Cemetery. But, he was fortunate that he was liked enough that he got to be transferred elsewhere.
Well, and that people from the prison and the warden chipped in to help out, help his mother, and despite his life of crime, that he was liked and ultimately, I think, a good guy. And people, to some extent, that's really interesting, and that's very touching on the part of the warden and the fellow prisoners to do that. It's very interesting.
It's just I didn't know how to end this story, because it was just wow, it just was so sudden. He was probably looking at I might be able to get out in the next year or two. So if my mom can hold on, I can take care of her after this. But for it to just escalate into an argument where somebody gets so upset that they're intoxicated by this emotion and commit this murder, whoa, man. So that's the story of William Wilde.
That was a real wild story.
Yeah, definitely. So thank you. Thanks for sticking in there throughout that whole journey through the Wild West, the remaining Wild West of the Northwest.
Truly.
A lot of emotions in the story.
Skye, what do you have for us today? Oh my gosh,
I'm so excited. Okay, today I have got number 10233, Ina Jane Paul. So quite a few sources today. Her inmate file, of course, which we get from the Idaho State Archives, newspapers.com records, ancestry.com records, the history page on cityoflapway.com, 2 articles, one titled Idaho had 6 federal Native American boarding schools, here's what we know about them, and Boarding Schools, Complicated Legacy, Still Haunts Native American Communities. Both of those are by Carly Flandro from idahoednews.org, and this seems like a really great resource about, and pretty unbiased information about what's going on with education in Idaho, and I think we should all really stay abreast about what's going on with education in the state these days. Also found a Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative investigative report from the Department of the Interior from May 2022 at fdlp.gov. Copies of legal decisions on Justia. Those 2 cases are Seymour versus Schneckloth from 1959 and Seymour versus Superintendent from 1962. The official General Land Office record for the week of April 11th, 2011 on the flight of the Nez Perce, and then just a little bit of information from Wikipedia pages of History of Tuberculosis, Lapway High School, and the Mary Immaculate School. Ina Jane Paul was born on January 8th, 1925 in Lapway, Idaho to Richard Paul and Maisie Red Wolf Paul. Both of her parents were enrolled members of the Nez Perce Indigenous tribe, and Ina was raised on the Nez Perce Reservation, and her younger sister Josephine was born about 14 months later. According to her mother, her parents divorced when she was about 5 years old. The Indian Census Roll record from 1931 shows Ina living with her father and younger sister. According to her mother, her father worked for the U.S. government at some times, but a lot of the censuses list his occupation as a farmer most of the time. However, Ina's paternal grandparents were prominent farmers in the area, and her maternal grandparents were very well respected in the community as well. Her childhood is a little bit unclear. Her mother stated that at some point when she was quite young, and again, no age on that, she had to go to the Lapway Sanitarium for tuberculosis, and she actually had to stay there for about 5 years. In the 1930s, when Ina was young, tuberculosis certainly was declining, but it was, and to be honest, still is, a threatening disease. So in 1863, Fort Lapway had been constructed following the Treaty of 1873, and that same treaty also established the Nez Perce Reservation after Idaho gained status as a territory. In 1884, Fort Lapway was decommissioned as a fort, and the following year, in 1885, it was converted into a government Indian boarding school. So I just want to do a quick little rabbit hole because this is a very important part of our history as a nation, our history as the West, our history as a state. So for those of you who might not know, the U.S. government opened many Indian boarding schools across the country, and these schools were designed to take Indigenous children away from their families and their cultures and to assimilate them into Anglo-American culture and thereby, quote-unquote, civilize them and thereby eradicate Indigenous cultures almost entirely. So Carly Flandreau wrote an article for Idaho Ed News titled Boarding Schools Complicated Legacy Still Haunts Native American Communities. And in it she wrote, quote, "The United States government aimed to break what made these communities strong, family ties, a migrant way of life, language, culture, and tradition. In doing so, they could essentially corner tribes until they were forced to give up their land." And the Commissioner of Indian Affairs wrote, "It is cheaper to educate our wards than to make war on them." And that was from the 1886 annual report to the U.S. Interior Secretary. And then Carly Flandreau goes on to say, quote, "Under the guise of goodwill, schools became a military tool to oppress a perceived enemy and self-sustaining labor camps where Native Americans were forced to work and pay for their own subjugation. Likely tens of thousands of children died at these schools due to malnourishment, harsh conditions, and disease. They are buried in unmarked graves, a number of which are still undiscovered," end quote. Wow. So at these schools, the children's hair was cut, they lost their native names in favor of anglicized ones, and they were forbidden to speak their language or engage in their traditional cultural practices. They were forced to do manual labor for up to half of each day, and they were often underfed and neglected, and abuse of all kinds was rampant. So the Department of the Interior released a report in May 2022 about these government-run Indian boarding schools. And in this report, they described the overcrowding in all these boarding schools, sometimes with 2 or 3 children to a bed. A report made at the request of the Secretary of the Interior in 1928 reported, quote, "The labor of Indian children as carried on in Indian boarding schools would, it is believed, constitute a violation of labor laws in most states," end quote. And this is in 1928. Wow. There still is child labor. By then, it's, I think, really on its way out. The last few laws are, if they are not passed yet, are about to be. And that really shows how bad it is, if it would constitute violation of labor laws in those states.
Well, in what schools do you do hard labor?
Right, exactly. Yeah. So children at these schools raised livestock and poultry and produced agriculture. They worked on railroads and in rail cars. They worked in lumber, carpentry, blacksmithing, well digging, irrigation system developments, furniture making, cooking, laundry, ironing, garment making, often making clothes for themselves and the other children at the school. Sometimes these products were sold to the community and they made money for the school and they didn't ever have to pay for the labor. This report that came out in 2022 also acknowledged 53 boarding school burial sites of the 431 federal Indian boarding schools across 27 states or territories. So Idaho had 6 government Indian boarding schools and more that were run independently by churches or other organizations. So in the north, we had the St. Joseph Mission School at Cul-de-Sac. That was between 1874 and 1968. Fort Lapway, it was also known as the Lapway Training School. That was from 1885 to 1909. We had the Mary Immaculate School at the Mission of the Sacred Heart of De Smet for Coeur d'Alene children. This was actually a girls-only boarding school. It was on the Coeur d'Alene Reservation in Bennewauk County. That went from 1878 to 1974. And then there was the Nez Perce... 1974, yes.
That outlived the penitentiary.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then lastly, there was the Nez Perce boarding school in Lapway from 1868 to 1893. And that's just in the north. Then in central Idaho, there was really briefly the Lemhi boarding school in Lemhi. It went from 1885 to 1907, according to the reports. That one wasn't super well attended. And then in southern Idaho, we had the Fort Hall boarding school, and this is at the site of the first military Fort Hall. That went from 1874 to 1936. And then there was also the Western Shoshone boarding school. This was actually in Owyhee, Nevada, which is just south of the Idaho border, but it served Idaho students. And that went from 1881 to 1917. These boarding schools are an important piece of history. They are just now starting to get a lot more attention from historians and the general public, which is honestly like the least that they deserve. Yeah. So back to Fort Lapwai and Ina. So in 1907, after it had become an Indian boarding school, the fort site is converted into a tuberculosis sanatorium and preventorium. So it was a hospital building for patients infected with tuberculosis, not showing active signs of the disease. So I wonder if maybe Ina had had active tuberculosis and then was put in the preventorium until she was all better, just to make sure that she wasn't maybe taking the disease back to her family or something like that. But we'll never know how long she was there or where she had been, because the sanatorium closed in 1945 after a fire gutted the original wing of the school and destroyed all the records. So, after her time at the sanatorium, Ina's mother said she went to public school, and she also might have attended that Indian boarding school while she was there for the tuberculosis. For some period of time, she lived with her grandparents, but again, I'm not completely sure when. So anyway, after Ina's junior year, she left home to go to Bremerton, Washington, to take a babysitting job. Bremerton is all the way on the other side of Washington from the Idaho border. It's just west of Seattle. And in March 1943, Ina married John Espana Valley, born in Iowa in 1919 of Mexican parents. 4 years after their marriage, unfortunately, John died from tuberculous meningitis on January 9th, 1947. And it's both meningitis and tuberculosis are like terrible on their own, so imagining them together, I cannot even imagine. So unfortunately, he dies in January 1947, probably soon after, though I don't have record to verify when, she married a man named Richard Lawyer. He was also a Nez Perce tribal member in what authorities called a quote-unquote Indian custom. Richard had been married once before, and he had 2 daughters. By 1950, 3 years later, the couple were living in Lapwai with a 3-year-old son, Thomas, and a 1-year-old daughter, Lydia, but they were divorced by quote-unquote Indian council within about a year of the 1950 census. Ina's daughter, Imogene, was born around 1952 or 1953, and Imogene's father was a man named Lawrence Gowdy, a member of the Yakima tribe in Washington state, whom Ina married, but it is unclear exactly when they married and when they divorced. They might have even married, divorced, and remarried again in 1959. I did find a record that places them together, but it's kind of difficult to tell in these things. So throughout the 1950s, her living situation is hard to pin down, and from what I've been able to tell, a little insecure. She had jobs as a waitress at various restaurants in Seattle, Spokane, and Lewiston, Idaho. Her mother stated that her husband died in a car wreck in about 1956, but I'm not sure who this husband was, because it's not Lawrence Gowdy if they were married in 1959. And her mother also said after Ina's husband's death in this car wreck, Ina began to struggle with, quote, drinking and self-pity, end quote, which her mother considered the reason for Ina's general misconduct. However, Ina was an active member in a few voluntary associations. She was part of the VFW, which is the Veterans of Foreign Wars Auxiliary. She was eligible for that through her first husband, John Valley, who would serve during World War II. She was also part of the Women's Missionary Society of the Spalding Presbyterian Church. In 1957, she was arrested in Spokane under the name Victoria Ina Black Eagle for a traffic violation. She was fined and released. What we do know for sure is in about 1959, Ina was arrested for forgery in Lewiston, Idaho. But, curiously, she was being held for having committed the crime in Lewis County, a majority of the county of which is on the Nez Perce Reservation. And I can't find a lot of details about this crime. She was originally held in Lewiston for forgery in Lewis County in January 1959, but she didn't enter the penitentiary, the Idaho State Penitentiary, until May 17th, 1959. So when she's arrested in May 17th, this is 3 days after she had been rearrested for violating her parole. So I wonder if she had been held for a short time in Lewis County, then released on parole. She also could have been put on parole instead of being incarcerated and then violated that parole. Yeah. And so for that violation, she was sentenced to 2 to 5 years. When she enters the state penitentiary, she was the 11th female inmate in the women's ward. This was certainly at a time of a high capacity, and she actually ended up serving with another 9 inmates in just 1 year. But she was released a year later on May 17th, 1960. And so part of the reason she probably was out so quickly is because it was such a high turnover, or high population. So she's released from parole for this first offense. Then, just 9 days later, on May 26, 1960, at the Idaho department store in Lewiston, Idaho, a $50 check made out to Josephine Whitstocking, signed by Roy Fish, was cashed. So this is an important detail to keep in mind. Allegedly, Ina was arrested in Butte, Montana for vagrancy in July 1960, but released after 10 days in jail, and she once again returned to Lapwai. It seems like once she returned home, though, the authorities pursued her as the forger of the check cashed at the Idaho department store back in May. In September, an article appeared in the Spokane Daily Chronicle which announced that Justice John Maynard took Ina's case under advisement. It was announced that Ina was being held in the Nez Perce County Jail under a $2,000 bond until a decision on her case was reached. So her trial, after she is being held in the Nez Perce County Jail, her trial doesn't begin for another 2 months in November 1960. She pleaded not guilty, but the jury convicted her, and she entered the Idaho State Penitentiary on November 13th, 1960. And her charge actually is for parole violation for forgery, not just straight for forgery, because again, she had that chance, and it to the authorities appeared that she blew it.
During her first year, what was she sentenced to?
She was sentenced to 2 to 5 years.
2 to 5. Wow, and she only
served 1. Yeah.
Yeah, that is funny. Usually it's at least 3/4.
Yeah, and usually for forgery it's 1 to 14 years, and so I don't know if it was because like if it was some weird combination of it was her first offense and the women's ward was so full.
At capacity.
Yes, at capacity. So I'm wondering if it was kind of like, okay, we'll release you on parole, just don't do anything more, and then she was arrested for this other check. So her intake form, pretty sparse amounts of information, again, from Nez Perce County: race, Indian, sex, female, age 36, height 61 1/2 inches, so she's about 5'1", weight 133, eyes black, hair black, complexion is listed as brown Indian, occupation waitress. They list her marital status as widowed, and she has 3 children, and education she quit in the 11th grade. So the second time she enters, she's actually one of 14 inmates, so it's actually more full the second time that she comes in. And there were actually 4 women who were still there from the first time that she left. They were Frances Irene Smith, in for burglary, Elda Lee Lennon, who was in for forgery. I cover her in episode 78, Marianne Gardner, who was also in for forgery, and Lucille Harem, who was in for involuntary manslaughter. She would serve with 4 others before her release, though this time she was in for longer than a year. About a month after she entered the penitentiary, her mother returned a social survey about Ina's childhood, and on the back of it, she wrote a letter in which she made clear what she thought Ina's real problem was. She said, quote, "When my daughter Ina Jane Valle returned home to us, she'd done very well. She would drive her children to Spalding Presbyterian Church on Sundays for Sunday schools. She could cook and wash and iron clothes, and she could sew, until people that drink began to come around and took her. When she drinks, she will go on for days and drink. She wanted to quit drinking, and she wanted people to pray for her so she could stop drinking. I am her mother and would like very much for a help in some way." There was some, I couldn't read the handwriting, but she's looking very much for a help in some way so she can quit her drinking. She has 2 very nice girls here at my home. They pray that God will change their mother's ways. She won't ever drink again, end quote. And this is signed Maisie Ramsey because her mother had remarried. And as so often as we see, her time in the penitentiary was pretty unremarkable. Matron Lulu Rowan said of her, quote, "This person was cooperative and worked well when she was here," end quote. And then something kind of curious happens in May 1962. On May 31st, Warden Clapp received a letter from Warren Felton, who was the Assistant Attorney General from the state of Idaho, who was coincidentally from, or maybe not so coincidentally, from Nez Perce County. And in this letter, he contends that Ina Paul, a member of a recognized indigenous tribe, had committed a felony crime on an Indian reservation. And if you've listened to the podcast for a long time, this may start to seem familiar. So this is a problem because in 1948, a federal law was passed that declared that certain crimes committed on an Indian reservation, outside of 9 exceptions, were subject to the jurisdiction of the indigenous tribes, meaning the state could not prosecute them. So those 9 exceptions are murder, manslaughter, rape, incest, assault with intent to kill, assault with a dangerous weapon, arson, burglary, robbery, and larceny. So, Felton contended that because Ina's crime of forgery had been committed on the Nez Perce Reservation in the city of Lewiston, the state of Idaho had no authority to hold Ina in the state penitentiary. Now, here's the curious part. Lewiston has not been a part of the Nez Perce Reservation since the 1860s. And just a quick note, I'm telling this story with the help of the official General Land Office story map on the Flight of the Nez Perce webpage. It's a very, very cool ArcGIS webpage that effectively and simply tells the story of the flight of the Nez Perce through documents, maps, and images on a user-friendly site. Really love this source. Definitely check it out. So after the creation of the Oregon Territory in 1848 and the Washington Territory in 1853, tense negotiations between the U.S. government and the Nez Perce began. Then, in 1855, these negotiations between the government and the Nez Perce ended with the Nez Perce ceding 7.5 million acres of their tribal land, but retaining their right to hunt and fish in their normal spots. The U.S. agreed, and they also agreed to provide schools, trade shops, hospitals, and cash payments to the tribe and its leaders. So the original Nez Perce Reservation went as far north as Potlatch, which is 60 miles north of the current boundary. It went across the Washington border west of Pullman, Washington, south actually through a corner of Oregon, and almost as far south as McCall. So it's a huge reservation, and they had already given up 7.5 million acres. And so in this original iteration of the reservation, Lewiston is a part of the reservation. Then, in 1860, gold is discovered within the boundaries of the reservation. And so, unfortunately, as we so often see, rather than preventing trespassers from encroaching on reservation land, the U.S. government initiated a treaty council in 1863 that would shrink the reservation by another 90%. So the members of the Nez Perce groups who lived outside of the proposed boundary line walked out of proceedings, refusing to accept the treaty, and they eventually became known as the non-treaty Nez Perce. Their fight to retain their homelands resulted in the Nez Perce War, which ended in 1877 after the flight of the Nez Perce as they sought sanctuary through 4 different states, being stopped 40 miles south of the Canadian border. And had they made it to that Canadian border, the U.S. forces would not have been able to pursue them any further. But the leaders of those peoples who lived inside this proposed boundary, they did sign the treaty. And so Congress ratified that treaty in 1867. And in this new reservation, Lewiston is about 5 miles west of the boundary, which is still the boundary today. So despite this, Felton wrote to Warden Clapp, quote, "Lewiston appears, from my research, as well as Mr. Swope's, to be well within the boundary of the Nez Perce Reservation, and, as we understand it, the crime which Ina Paul was convicted of was allegedly to have happened in Lewiston." And he has a map. There's actually a map within her inmate file, and he says, quote, "I have drawn a circle around the area of Lewiston on this map, which I enclose. Although the map is not too easily clear, the outlines are clear enough so you can easily see that Lewiston and all of Nez Perce County are within the boundaries of the Nez Perce Reservation," end quote. He's correct. The map is not completely clear. But even from what I can make out, it just doesn't really make sense because Lewiston, like, it's almost like they're claiming that because Lewiston was part of the first reservation, that sort of retroactively makes it so that she shouldn't be charged. But we have other inmates who committed their crime in Lewiston. They were Native Americans, often Nez Perce. And they try to use this argument, but people will say, no, Lewiston is not a part of the reservation, therefore they have to serve. Yeah. So they even cited a lawsuit to try to, like, argue it, and I'm not a lawyer. I did not get into history to be a lawyer, so the jargon, I know. I love to argue. So it just doesn't really make sense. So this apparently was an acceptable argument because Ina was released from the penitentiary on June 4th, 1962 on a writ of habeas corpus. Ina returned to Lapwai after her release from prison to live with her mother and children. Apparently her son and one of her daughters spent time in St. Anthony, both while she was incarcerated and soon after she got out, but I don't know why. But according to her parole officer, quote, she says she realizes her mistakes and doesn't want to make them anymore, end quote. Her case was actually passed on to the next session of the Board of Corrections several times to get pardoned. Like, she was released, but she was trying to get a full pardon. She never was granted that full pardon, but she was released after serving 1 year, 6 months, and 22 days. What she did over the next few years isn't totally clear. We find her next in Spokane, Washington, where she was arrested on February 8th, 1967 for first-degree forgery. According to a Spokane Chronicle article, she had two accomplices, Titus and Catherine and Riley Howard. So apparently she forged 8 checks. Catherine passed 2 of them for $32 total, and then Howard passed the other 6 for $95. All 3 of them pleaded guilty, and allegedly these checks had come from an acquaintance who was in the hospital, and so they were trying to get money from this person. In June, she was ordered to serve 6 months in jail and make restitution on the $127 that she had forged, and then she was placed on a 10-year probation. However, the 2 men were given prison sentences of about 20 years.
Wow.
Yeah. And so I don't know if it was because of her children or if she was able to make the restitution, and so they say, okay, if you make the restitution, then we'll let you out. These things are always curious when they happen. Apparently, she again violated her probation after she, quote, had failed to comply with the requirements of 3 different probation programs, end quote. I don't really know what this means, but much like she did here, she did have to go in and spend time in Walla Walla for a couple months, both, I think, in 1967 and 1968. Again, these records are a little bit unclear. Yeah. In March 1969, the Spokane Chronicle announced she was again arrested for forgery, apparently receiving 1.5 years by the Washington State Board of Prison Terms and Parole. Then, on November 14th, 1969, she filed for a marriage license to Riley Howard. And if you remember, Howard was one of the accomplices that was arrested with her in February 1967. He's the one who cashed the majority of those checks. The image that is included in the ancestry record online shows that Ina and Riley applied for and had been issued a marriage license, but the spaces in which they recorded the dates of the actual marriage were blank. So they might not have actually gotten married. They might have just applied for the license, and I don't know what happened, but it doesn't seem that they had actually gotten married. But then the rest of her story is pretty easily traced, but unfortunately not much longer. On December 17th, 1977, Ina Jane Valle Paul passed away in St. Luke's Hospital in Spokane, Washington. Her death record notes that she had been suffering from cirrhosis of the liver for over 5 years, which ultimately is what led to her death. Her body was returned to Lapwai, and she was buried in the Lapwai Mission Cemetery in Spalding, and her headstone reads, quote, "Beloved Mother and Sister, Alpawa Band," end quote. So that is our number 10233, Ina Jane Paul.
Wow. And the Indian schools
yes.
that we're talking about. Oh,
yeah.
It's so terrible.
It's a really tragic chapter that I think that we as Americans really do have to reckon with. Mm-hmm. Because it is so unfortunate that the indigenous tribes of what is now our state have lost so much of their culture and their language because of these boarding schools. But they are, if you go onto, for example, the Nez Perce website, I think even the Shoshone-Bannock, they do have programs to try to reverse this damage that was done by these schools to teach the language, to try to carry on those traditions that the American government tried so hard to eradicate. So that was just a really important thing that I wanted to include because we can't ignore that, especially in this state. The state had a direct hand in that. So, but it's very curious about the tuberculosis. I had never seen that before, and the whole argument about Lewiston is on the reservation. It's just every once in a while I come upon these stories and I'm just like, this doesn't really make any sense, but this seems to be the story.
That's so interesting. And of course, with Lewiston, originally part of the Nez Perce land that they lived in, and of course they occupied, 13 million acres prior to this. I don't know. That's super interesting.
Yeah.
I love that light is being shown on these stories right now, and I'm glad that we're part of that.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. And I'm so glad that the Department of the Interior, they wrote this report, and I can only imagine how difficult that job was. And I'm sure difficult and uncomfortable for those of us now to reckon with. You know, it's really terrible to think that any one of our ancestors or anyone's family or whatever might have been involved in this. But it is really important, and I'm with you that I'm really glad that the Department of the Interior, because now that the government is recognizing it, I think it makes it easier for us to then really begin to start that healing process and work on bringing those stories to light, like you said, and we are so fortunate, I think, to be and lucky to be a part of that, to try to rectify that, but it's going to take a long time because it's a lot of damage that happened to them.
I love doing the podcast because we get to like learn about this
Absolutely.
stuff, because this is not something that I learned about in school.
Right.
And
or if you do, it's like one of those little boxes that's like 10 sentences, or not even 10, like 5 sentences, and that's all we can cover. But it do go to that Idaho Ed News, because it seemed very unbiased, that just this is the facts of it. And you know, we need education now more than ever. So please support our education, statewide education, your local school boards, whatever it takes. We have to help our future generations, you know, understand this stuff. So
support education, and then educators come get some field trips here at the Old Idaho Penitentiary.
That's
right.
Yeah. I love it.
But
Nice.
Well, another one in the books.
Another one in the books.
What are we at? Season 10?
This is 10.
This is
Yeah,
10.
and we're gonna hit
episode
100. We're gonna hit
Yeah,
100 at the end, Anthony. How
That is
I feel
so
that's
wild.
Talk about wild.
Yeah. We have some more wild stories coming
yes,
at you
we
this
do.
season. Oh my gosh. We have been so excited behind the scenes to do this, and there's so much going on at the prison right now. If you're listening to this, if you come this summer, chances are you're going to see some construction. We are making it more accessible at the site, so come visit still, please. But know that you might have to go through the Sally Port, which is also exciting.
That is very exciting. Yeah, I just it's been 5 years since I worked on site, and the changes that you both of you, I think, have helped facilitate in terms of interpretation and in terms of construction and making the site as accessible and interesting as possible. Like, I really think you guys are doing an incredible job. So congratulations to you guys.
That, Skye.
I appreciate that. And you're part of that. Like,
thank you.
Doing this, understanding the women's perspective and the women's experience, that's half the prison itself. That's such an important key part of it. So
and now we have a women's tour.
Which is so exciting.
Stay tuned.
So
you might see Sam on a regular weekly tour presentation hybrid tour. So
come talk about the Old West with me.
All right, everybody, thanks for tuning in. Do your own time,
do your own number.
See you next week, everybody.
Bye.
If you enjoyed Behind Gray Walls, please rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. Not only do we get to hear your feedback about the show, but it helps others find us as well. If you're interested in finding out more about the podcast and to see mugshots of the inmates featured in today's episode, follow our Facebook group at Behind Gray Walls Podcast. And we have a podcast Instagram as well. You can find us on Instagram at Behind Gray Walls Pod.